Day one of EAA AirVenture. Beautiful day. It's going to be a beautiful week. And we are happy to help you kick it off with the public forum for the EAGLE initiative. Today, we're going to give you an update, a status on where we are in the transition to unleaded fuel, a necessary yet a safe and smart transition for the general aviation industry. And if you are here today, and if you are here at EAA, and if you are in general aviation, you are an EAGLE stakeholder because you have a vested interest in general aviation's safe and smart transition to unleaded fuel. Whether you're a pilot, aircraft owner, elected official, airport sponsor, a manufacturer, an OEM or fuel manufacturer, or any other representative of any other corner, any other part of general aviation, you are a stakeholder, and this update is meant for you. So we're going to jump right in. We have a busy schedule. We're going to have some opening remarks from the EAGLE co-chairs, Kurt Castagna from industry, the president of the National Air Transportation Association, and Wes Moody of the FAA, acting executive director of aircraft certification. Before we get into that, I just wanted to level set and give a context and just remind everybody exactly what EAGLE is. As you can see here, in short, EAGLE is responsible for information, responsible for understanding and awareness to help general aviation bring about a safe and smart transition to all unleaded fuel by the end of 2030, if not sooner. And with that context and with that definition, I'd like to turn it over for a few minutes to our EAGLE co-chairs. Kurt?
That one? You want us to use this one?
Or the podium. All right. You can just leave it with that. Yeah.
All right. Good morning. Thank you for all being here, and thank you, Eric, for the introduction. As he said, I'm Kurt Castagna, president of NATA. It's our honor to serve as chair or co-chair of the EAGLE initiative. Today, the government and industry partners that you're going to hear from who make up EAGLE each bring a unique and often different perspectives representing our organization and our members in this issue. But we are very unified in our collective approach towards a lead-free future that preserves the piston aircraft fleet and utilizes our established general aviation infrastructure. Although individual companies participating in this process, including the unleaded fuel distributors, make their own business decisions and about approval pathways, commercialization, market deployment of fuels, EAGLE as an organization is committed to providing outreach, education, and information sharing to all of you as stakeholders to ensure a safe transition and a smart transition to those fuels. Key to that work is the continued access to 100 low lead. During this coordinated national transition, the FAA Reauthorization Act that was signed into law in May assures the availability of 100 low lead at publicly obligated airports through the end of 2030 via a new grant assurance. The bill also guides FAA and EAGLE on a national transition plan, which we have begun crafting together. As we work collaboratively together, we are making progress, and we are pleased to share the updates that you'll hear from today from both FAA and the other trade associations. Thank you again for being here. Mr. West.
Thanks, Kurt. I'm honored to be here today. I am the acting executive director for aircraft certification in the FAA, and I just inherited the role of co-chair for the EAGLE program. So in full disclosure, I will say the information that I've garnered in the last few weeks as they've tried to get me spun up to fill this role has been incredibly interesting and incredibly valuable, and I'm glad we're here to share that with you today. So I look forward to the continued work that the FAA and industry is doing together under the EAGLE initiative. I think we've got some great information for you today, and I'm really happy that you're all here to get that. So please let us know what we can do to help fill in the gaps for the knowledge gaps that you may have. With that said, I'll turn it back over to Eric.
All right, thank you, Kurt and Wes. So let's dive into a real tangible update and give you a sense of where we are and where the industry is. First, I'd like to call on Walter DeRozier from Gamma, who's going to give us a really in-depth yet high-level overlook at where we are and what are the elements of the transition, how it's complex, and what's actually involved in getting fuels to market.
Well, thank you, Eric. So it's going to be in-depth and high level, so that was interesting. Wanted to just thank everybody for the opportunity to be here and talk a little bit more about the scope and what our objectives and goals are as Eagle. We heard the high-level objective. There's many elements and many parts of actually getting to a program that can help facilitate and support a safe and smart transition to an unleaded replacement. So what we've tried to do is kind of put it together in a graphic that kind of walks through it. We've got printouts of the graphic that I'm going to walk through, available down here. They're also available. They're also available from the Eagle website, flyEAGLE.org. So what I'm going to do is just walk through the key elements and the key pieces. The key elements and the key pieces of actually identifying and transitioning to a viable replacement unleaded fuel for the existing fleet as it exists today. So as we all know, it all starts, you got to have fuel developers. And so the core of our solution collectively as an industry is for those individuals, for those companies who are actually doing the investment, doing the R&D, doing the development, and that's been going on for quite some time. And we're trying to help enable and facilitate that development and enable the transition to deploy those unleaded fuels. And so the core focus is initially on safety. So the safety of your engines, the safety of your aircraft. The FAA has two processes, two pathways by which the fuels are evaluated and assessed and can obtain an FAA approval or an authorization as safe to operate in those engines, in those airplanes. So the one that I'm showing up on the screen right now is a fleet authorization pathway that Congress established, primarily designed to incentivize and bring in some traditional fuel developers at the beginning of the program. Those fuel developers are not experts in certification testing on aircraft and engine. So the fleet authorization program was established as a collaborative industry and government to help enable and support and facilitate the testing and evaluation of a fuel towards a fleet authorization. With that, there's also an ASTM specification that the information that's developed as part of that not only supports the FAA fleet authorization, but it allows and supports the information necessary to work toward obtaining an ASTM production specification for fuel. The second FAA pathway is a traditional type certification pathway. So under a supplemental type certificate, an STC, you can have organizations that are knowledgeable in type certification work directly with the FAA in evaluating and assessing the fuel on those engines and on those airplanes and obtain the STC for an approved model list. So for a range of fleet of engines and aircraft that are eligible, and to obtain that in support of the FAA approval as being safe to operate in your engines and in your airplanes. Also, they can take that information and towards the development of a specification. We have two types of specifications out there today. The traditional ASTM production specification, which is a consensus standard specification for the fuel. And we have a company specification that can be part of this certification type design under STC that are all part of that fuel. So the two candidates in that right now working in that direction are GAMI and SWIFT. Ultimately, the eligibility of those approvals, whether it's through the fleet authorization or whether it's through STC, will identify which engines and which aircraft are eligible as being safe to operate. It'll come with installation instructions available to you, the owner-operators for your aircraft, for your engines, to be able to put them onto your aircraft and the proper documentation authorizing you to use a new fuel on your existing aircraft. One of the elements that Eagle was set up is as these fuels are being developed, there's a potential that some particular engines or some particular aircraft may have some kind of impact in some way. So Eagle was set up we also established an R&D pillar and an innovation pillar that can take a look at where those gaps might be They can evaluate and assess potential solutions, bring those solutions to market so that it'll be available to you if you happen to have one of those engines and airplanes that might be impacted or might be affected. Now, those solutions aren't necessarily always a physical change to your aircraft. Many of those are going to be operational evaluations and something that can be done on the operational side, on the limit side, or potentially if there's certain technologies, it could be addressed on that. Now, that's only if there's a need based on the identification of a particular fuel and the performance of that fuel on the current fleet. So we've got a mechanism there to help facilitate and support those solutions so that no aircraft is left behind. Now, the next big phase is the really, really big, important phase in terms of how do you actually deploy a new fuel? There's many stakeholders involved in getting a new fuel deployed. It has to be produced, it has to be distributed and brought out. It has to go to FBOs at thousands and thousands of airports. We got to have the ability to dispense and put into your engines, or into your aircraft so you can operate on it. We're going to have airworthiness support from manufacturers in terms of the support they provide to their customers and understand operating on a new fuel, what that might mean. We're going to have warranty support for some of that. So there's many, many stakeholders involved in helping put into place the business decisions to purchase, to distribute, to store, to dispense, and to support the operation of your aircraft on a new fuel. So getting it to you at those airports. So a lot of that are many other stakeholders, from the manufacturers and the producers of fuels and chemicals, to the distributors, to the FBOs, to the manufacturers. And a lot of that information and understanding and knowledge about the fuel is gained through the coordination and participation in some of the activities, such as through a consensus standards process in understanding the fuel so that they can make their business decisions, or other mechanisms by which that information can be shared with them so they can make the business decisions on being able to exercise the ability to purchase, store, distribute, and dispense fuel. So all of this is underpinned by a broader policy and regulatory activity in terms of enabling and facilitating a smart transition. We're all familiar with the fact that the EPA has undertaken rulemaking, and they have published a final decision on an endangerment finding that lead emissions from aircraft cause a risk to the public. And so they've identified a need to look at how do you transition away from that. Our program is focused on doing that in a smart and reasonable way that has minimum impact on the fleet. So part of that is making sure that we as stakeholders can inform that process, that regulatory and policy process that will move forward on how they're going to enable or mandate some kind of a transition. Our plan is to do that first, and ultimately, whatever rulemaking comes out, hopefully the goal is we will inform that, and it will align and be done in a way that has minimum impact on our ability to continue to fly and operate, and then reasonably and smartly transition to a replacement fuel. So as I said, the chart that you can actually read instead of on the screen is printouts are available here, also from the flyEAGLE.org website. And then obviously the sponsors and the supporters of all these activities are being supported by some of the industry trade groups and EAA and AOPA and others with GAMA and in cooperation with the FAA. But the expertise and the knowledge and the participants that come into it are from the fuel producers and the subject matter experts that are part of those activities supporting that. Thank you.
Thank you, Walter. Thank you for that update, which really sets the stage for the discussions we're having moving forward. Even though we have a very sharp mission, a very sharp vision of an unleaded general aviation future by the end of this decade, you can see that the issue is complex. There are a lot of moving parts, and it's probably more complex than a lot of people think, and it's more complex than some people may say. So one of the things that Walter spoke about, and now I'd like to call on Maria Di Pasquantonio of the FAA, is the fuel sponsors, the fuel manufacturer is central to Eagle and central to the unleaded transition. And let's get an update on where we are in terms of the fuels from Maria.
All right, thank you, Eric, and good morning to all of you, and welcome to our discussion here on Eagle. And I do want to thank EAA and our sponsors, Jack Pelton and his team, for hosting us today. I think this is actually the third year that we've been here giving an update on Eagle, and so we've got a bit more progress to share with you today. And thank you to Walter for sort of setting the stage. Now I'm going to be repeating a few points because I think there's some key takeaways that I want to make sure that is clear for all of you. But first and foremost, I want to say that Eagle supports all unleaded fuel candidates that are working to move forward. We've got a clear goal in getting to an unleaded future in 2030, and we're working with all of our fuel developers, partners, distributors, and so forth to make that dream a reality. So I'll give you a quick update on where we are, and then we'll go into a little bit more details into one of the fuels that is actually going through testing at our tech center in Atlantic City, New Jersey. So as Walter mentioned, there's two pathways. There's the fleet authorization pathway that we're working with the Piston Aviation Fuels Initiative that is linked to having an ASTM standard. And then we've got the traditional STC pathway. So I'll give an update briefly on where we are on those. So under the fleet authorization, one of the fuel candidates that we were working with over the last 2.5 years plus, Apton Phillips 66 had a fuel that we were evaluating, but during the course of the initial evaluation, we ran into some issues related to the durability testing and found some deposits there. So we had conversations with the team, and the decision was made that we were going to pause that testing. But we have gotten assurance from the Phillips 66 leadership that they are committed to Eagle and the vision to get to an unleaded future by 2030. So I want to thank all the work that the team has done in getting to that, and certainly wish them well in the future. Now, under the STC, we have two fuels that have gone through or are going through that process. The first we awarded to GAMI, an approved model list STC, to use their G100 fuel in all certified piston engines and airplanes. And right now, they've also worked to obtain an STC for the rotorcraft, and we're working with them closely at the FAA. Also, in support of that, Vital Aviation has produced an initial production of approximately 1.3 million gallons of G100 UL fuel, which is available for purchase. And we certainly hope that operators will have the opportunity to use that fuel very soon. I also, a little bit of a commercial. I want to note that for those of you here that are interested in hear more about the GAMI fuel, that Mr. George Browley, who's with us today, is going to be hosting a forum on Thursday from 11:30 to 12:45 in the forum stage 8, right next door to here, entitled "Will Your Engine Survive Unleaded?" So I certainly encourage those of you that are interested to attend that forum to learn more. So also under the STC pathway, we have Swift Fuels, and they've submitted all of their information for an initial STC for the use of their fuel, which is called 100R. And so we're currently reviewing that information at the FAA. And in addition, Swift has also submitted to expand that to an AML STC for both airplanes and engines. And again, we're working very closely with them. Swift also, you heard Walter mention about the ASTM process. Swift is working with ASTM International to obtain a production specification for their fuel. Also, another commercial here for Swift. So Chris DaCosta from Swift Fuels will be hosting actually two forums. The first tomorrow from 10 to 11:15 at the Ultralight Forum tent, and then the second one on Thursday, 8:30 to 9:45 at Forum Stage 2. So again, certainly encourage all of you that are interested to learn more. And then finally, the fourth fuel that we've been working with is a team between Lyondale, Bissell, and VP Racing. They're working a fuel called UL100E that is currently undergoing full-scale testing at our FAA Technical Center in Atlantic City, New Jersey. And that's going through the fleet authorization and PAFI process that you heard about. So we're doing engine and performance testing on 10 different engine models, and we're also going to be doing some comprehensive flight testing on 8 different aircraft models, including the helicopter. We're anticipating that full-scale testing will take about 12 to 18 months, and after that we'd authorize use of that fuel after successfully completing all that. So third commercial, you can hear more about the Lyondell-Basell fuel by Dan Perot, who is their president and CEO, during the forum on Wednesday from 8:30 to 9:45 at Forum Stage 11, entitled UL 100E PAFI Testing Update. So we'll also, as the next part of this presentation, I'm going to go into a little bit more details in terms of that fuel that we're testing as the UL 100E. And then finally, of note for some of you that may have seen it, Andrew Findlay actually flew his Lancer one moment at the Super Legacy aircraft, actually flew that in the air race yesterday. And so I know he's on site here today, so if you have the opportunity, we'd certainly encourage you to spend some time. So again, just to kind of reiterate where I started, is EAGLE supports all fuel candidates that are working to move towards transitioning a safe and smart transition to unleaded fuel for all of you, all of the operators, owners, and maintainers. So thank you for your interest and for listening, and I'll turn it back to Eric for a moment.
Thank you for that update, Maria. Again, a complex issue, but moving forward, progress, challenges ahead, and we're moving forward. So, Maria, your overview on the status of fuels begs the question, or the statement. Tell me a little bit more about fuel evaluation and authorization. So, Maria and Walter, tell us a little more about fuel authorization and evaluation.
Thank you again. So back for a little bit more details. So all of this is part of the EAGLE introduction. So EAGLE is made up of 4 pillars that we're calling them, are really work streams. So 2 are led by the government and 2 are led by our industry colleagues. So the unleaded fuel authorization evaluation is actually led by a government team. I'm part of that team, but I also want to certainly acknowledge all of the folks that are back in the office working hard and at the Tech Center in Atlantic City to move forward. In particular, I do want to acknowledge Mr. Tim Hohen, who's a critical partner at the FAA, and we'll be briefing his results from his testing that he's worked with the team. So first, we've got some just general objectives related to the pillar. So obviously, we want to make sure that we complete testing for the candidate unleaded fuels, as I mentioned. Our goal is to identify at least one unleaded fuel for widespread use, although as you heard me mention earlier, we're working with 3 candidates right now. We also are working to institutionalize the fleet authorization process for unleaded fuels, and then all of the pillars are certainly interested in education, awareness, and outreach. And again, the opportunity today to brief you is part of our goals to do that. So our key considerations are fuel safety, fuel quantity, and certainly looking at any impacts to the fleet. And we've got a number of deliverables that we've been working. We've authored a policy statement on the fleet authorization process. We've actually published test plans that you can actually see on the flyEAGLE.org website. We have a lessons learned document. As a result of all the prior testing that's been going on from PAFI over the last number of years, we have lessons learned and best practices. Again, all of that information is available on our flyEAGLE.org website. And then we're going to be producing other reports and so forth as we continue the evaluation. So the way we've established the program is really we've set up gates. So we've identified sort of initial testing phases that are gates 1, 2, and 3. And so those initial phases are looking at some parts of materials compatibility. We're looking at some materials related to articles and sealants and fuel bladders and so forth. We're also looking at engine performance properties. We're looking at performance and detonation. And then finally doing some mini durability tests, running a 150-hour endurance test on a number of engines. So once those gates are successfully completed, we're moving into full-scale testing. And as I mentioned, that's where we are now on the Lyondell-Basell fuel. We're actually in what we're calling gate 4. So we're doing full-scale materials compatibility, and we're looking at that to be about a quarter complete. We're also doing performance and detonation on a number of engines, and I'll go into a little bit more detail here on the next slide. We're doing durability testing in about a 25% complete on that. And then we do other testing, prop vibe testing and so forth, cold start testing. And then finally, the final piece of the full-scale testing is actually doing flight testing, aircraft flight testing on 9 different models. So this is a chart, again, that you can find on the website. We're going to be updating this as time moves forward in terms of the process that we're moving forward in testing the 100 UL fuel. So you can see on the detonation and performance, we're about 40% complete on the Continental TSIO 520 VB. We're also looking at doing testing on 5 different additional engines to support that detonation and performance testing. And then we move into durability and performance testing. We're about 25% complete. We've actually completed 350 hours on that Continental TSIO 550K, and then we've got 3 additional engines that we'll be doing that same testing on. I mentioned aircraft testing, so we've included here that Lancair Super Legacy aircraft. So we've got about 75% testing completed on that, and we're hoping to complete the other 25% in the near future. And then you can see we've got quite a variety of aircraft that we're actually going to be doing further testing. Robinson, a helicopter, as I mentioned. We've got a Cirrus SR-22T. We've got a Beechcraft, a couple Cessnas, a Piper Malibu, another Cessna turbocharged, and then a T-46. T6G, excuse me. I'm going back to my Navy days. And then we're doing additional testing. So we've got some propeller vibe days that we're doing. We're doing cold start testing and then some fuel quantity testing. And then we do a lot of materials compatibility, and you'll hear more in a minute from Walter on that. But again, making sure that the fuel is compatible with all the sealants, bladders, hoses, and everything else in your aircraft. And so we test metallics, we test non-metallics, we test paint systems, which are about complete at this point. We're looking at different fabric systems, polysulfides, O-rings, aircraft hoses, and then we're also looking at testing those components that are in the distribution system, so fuel bladders. We're testing composites for those of you, the experimental aircraft owners and operators, looking at composite resins and other composites, and then finally making sure that our OEMs are satisfied with the fuel as well in terms of how it interacts with their parts. So we're doing some materials testing and then also some OEM wing testing with 4 different aircraft. So in order to support all this testing, we need a lot of fuel. And so we're planning right now on getting about 50,000 gallons of the Lyondell VP-UL 100E fuel. And you can see on this notional map where we're actually looking to get the fuel out there to be able to be tested. We've got about 8 or 10 locations identified with some of our key OEM engine and aircraft partners. And the little boxes you see there are actually about 55-gallon drums that have already been delivered to those locations for testing, with certainly more coming in the future. So again, Eagle, and particularly the fuel evaluation and authorization pillar, is certainly a government industry collaboration where we're relying on our industry partners as well as our own internal teams to make sure that we're doing our due diligence testing and ensuring that at the end of the day we do have a safe fuel that is going to go into all the aircraft that all of you are flying out there. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Walter to walk you through a little bit more of some of the materials and other testing.
Thank you, Maria. So I wanted to go back a little bit to the big picture slide I talked about earlier and all those different flow charts. So this puts this test program under PAFI and taking a look at all the areas that Maria just talked about on the testing. The light blue bar in each box is kind of that status, and that'll be updated over time in terms of where that status. But there's a couple of different flow paths in terms of the activity that Eagle is supporting to help enable and facilitate a new fuel to get to the actual market and to be a viable replacement for 100 low lead. So we talked a lot about the testing in the engines and airplanes. That's about safety. That's about meeting the requirements and getting the FAA authorization or approvals necessary as meeting all the safety airworthiness standards so that you can put the the fuel is safe in your airplane. But we also talked about as Eagle that we're supporting the broader community in terms of how do we now enable and facilitate the deployment of a new fuel. So a lot of that data that's generated as part of the PAFI testing is all being used not only to support the FAA in the safety assessments and issuance of their approvals and authorization, but also that data is then provided to the fuel developer who can then bring that forward and work through the ASTM consensus standards process towards a fuel production specification. So the green lines kind of indicate the data going into the ability to obtain a ASTM fuel production specification. That's all the data that can be made available to those that are participating in the consensus process. It is a peer review of subject matter experts from across all the stakeholders who are participating, from fuel developers and fuel distributors, owner operators and user groups, from manufacturing groups, different authorities, and it's a global international standard, so there's a lot of engagement from subject matter experts. And through that expertise, they do reviews, they do lots of comments, there's lots of feedback, lots of questions that are asked, and that then provides the ability to provide additional information, additional understanding, communication about the fuel, what was evaluated, what was tested, and about the performance characteristics of the fuel itself, not focusing necessarily on the engine and the airplane, but focusing on all the other attributes that are important to understand about fuel in terms of what the producers need to understand, what distributors need to understand in terms of the infrastructure for distribution. So that information goes in through that process, and under PAFI and the test program, that is required to be obtained as part of the FAA's issuance of a fleet authorization at the end of that program. The purple lines in the middle identify that if, in the event, there's any engines and aircraft that have a potential impact, if there's any engines and airplanes that might not be included in the initial authorization, the purple lines indicate, as part of Eagle, we have an initiative that's ready and available to support the R&D and the testing necessary to look for mitigations, look for solutions, look for ways that we can make sure that no engine, no airplane is left behind. So I also just wanted to touch and highlight, Maria talked about a lot of that materials compatibility testing. It is one of the biggest potential impacts on aircraft when we look at the new fuels that are being developed and the formulations of those new fuels. There are new components, new constituents, new chemicals in these new fuels. And because of that, that means there's a lot of materials out there over the history of production of engines and airplanes for decades and decades and decades that are going to be potentially impacted. And so we're looking at a comprehensive assessment of what are the key areas to look at. ASTM, under their process, has identified with the input of the participants a list of materials to be considered as part of potential impact on the fleet. As part of the PAFI program, we've also had input from a broader community in terms of the distributors, from the producers, in terms of the infrastructure that's out there for fuel trucks, for fuel storage units, for filters that are used. And we've added those materials into the list in addition to what was already previously identified for a more comprehensive look. More specifically, we've also reached out to manufacturers for any additional and new materials that might not have been captured in previous lists. We've reached out. EAA has been really good in coordinating with their amateur build community, with the experimental community in terms of what are some of the additional types of materials that might be in that community that are different than what might be in the certified aircraft. And so the next couple of slides here just kind of show the categories of different types of materials that are specifically in the list that are being evaluated and tested. What PAFI has done is they've collected all this information, they've looked at the test methods for each of these materials, they've looked at the approach that we're going to take, and we've published a report on the PAFI website, flyEAGLE.org, that gives you a list of all these materials, all the test methods for these materials, and what are going to be considered when we evaluate the PAFI fuel. And it's available to be considered for any fuel, for any other organizations, for any operators, builders. You can take a look at that list of materials, know what's in there, know what's being evaluated, in terms of what you might be interested in. And so that continues that big long list. One of the additional elements I mentioned, the distribution system. These are a list of additional materials identified by the distributors in terms of tanks and trucks that are being considered and evaluated as part of that. Because the goal is to make sure that we can identify all those areas necessary for those business decisions to be made by producers, distributors, those who dispense, those who use, those who support aircraft in the fleet, to have that information available so that they can understand their business decision to help deploy and use new fuel. Thank you.
Just in case you weren't able to read every word on that last slide, it is on our website, which we'll talk about at the end. So thank you, Maria and Walter. As you can see, there is a lot that is complex but is ongoing in the name of progress. And going back to the chart that Walter opened up with, I now want to talk about the next step that we are going to address, which is supply chain and infrastructure, getting the fuel from once it's evaluated, approved, and produced to the airport, into the wing of your airplane. And to talk about that phase and the work that she and Ryan Miller are doing in the pillar, Karen Huggard from NATA.
Good morning. I'm glad to be here today. I'm on behalf of the Eagle Supply Chain Infrastructure and Deployment Pillar, Pillar A lead Ryan Manner, who's not able to be here. I want to give you a high-level update on the Pillar's work. Pillar A's work has included the gathering and categorization of entities from across the country to identify the groups that are critical to a coordinated national deployment of fuel from production to end use. All right. So as you can see, the pillar's scope includes, I'm sorry, I already said that. The pillar has included the identification and coordination of more than 800,000 stakeholders in the following categories. We've got unleaded fuel producers. We've got more than 15 general aviation fuel distributors, approximately 3,500 fixed-based operators, more than 600,000 general aviation pilots, and 250,000 aircraft mechanics. Together, these stakeholders will deploy unleaded fuel in a fleet of more than 230,000 GA aircraft, including both certificated aircraft and approximately 30,000 experimental aircraft. As we approach fuel deployment, each of these entities, from producer to end user, will have to make individual decisions based on those emerging fuels. But the shared goal here for all of us is always delivery of clean, dry, on-spec fuel that enables safe aircraft operations. The data gathered by Pillar A is being used to inform regulations and policy, including the impending EPA FAA rulemaking, legislative policy proposals on Capitol Hill, as well as stakeholder decisions regarding the transition away from leaded fuel. It will also support the development of educational tools and programs, both for aviation businesses as well as individual pilots. Through weekly engagement with representatives of all of these identified stakeholder groups, Pillar A is working to identify risks ahead of a national transition. Pillar A also coordinates ongoing dialogue with the fuel developers, producers, and distributors. Pillar A has been providing those businesses the opportunity to routinely brief the Eagle Executive Committee on their progress, challenges, and the ways that Eagle can assist their efforts. Some of the key challenges that have been identified this far include the need to maintain access to 100 low lead during the transition, but also the need at times to have dual tankage in order to do that while deploying a new fuel. We've identified the limitations of tankage at airports and FBOs, gathering tank inventories across the country. Another risk is lack of understanding about the intermixability and fungibility of fuels, whether it's in fuel tanks, in the distribution system, or in the wing of the aircraft. We've identified that as a risk that we're working through. We've also identified the increased risk of misfueling once you bring multiple fuels onto airport. So working through education and understanding of those risks to mitigate that. Another huge risk has been premature action by local or state governments. An example of this would be thankfully failed attempts to ban 100 low lead in both California and Colorado this year. We anticipate that those local and state government actions may continue to be a risk to us having access to 100 low lead as we deploy the new fuels. We also are keenly aware of the vulnerability of the current unleaded avgas supply because of a single global producer of lead additive. All of this data that Pillar A has amassed is foundational to Eagle's work to develop a national transition plan as required by the FAA reauthorization law recently signed. You can track our progress of the supply chain infrastructure and deployment pillar. You can learn more about the findings and the outcomes on the Eagle website, flyEAGLE.org.
Thank you, Karen. While we're all one happy general aviation community, we do have our different perspectives, we do have our different challenges. So what I'd like to do now is to call on members of the Eagle Executive Committee who have a very specific lens through which they look at the unleaded fuel transition. And I'd love for them to take a moment to talk about what are the impacts and what are the status and progress with the transition through the lens that represents their community. So Kurt, you represent the FBOs and the businesses on the airports. Obviously, they have a vested interest in the transition. What's the status through the lens of those businesses?
Thanks, Eric. So as you've heard today through the updates provided by FAA, the three candidate fuels, they continue to make progress through the deployment testing, whether that's through PAFI or through the STC process. NATA's fuel distributors and FBOs are closely watching this process towards achievement for a high-octane replacement fuel with the necessary standards and protections for safe distribution. And as I think you saw in Walter's demonstration, there's a difference between the STC process and the PAFI process. And in the STC process, the approval for that STC, the FAA's review of that, stops at the wing of the airplane. And in the PAFI process, the material compatibility testing exceeds beyond the wing of the airplane through various areas of the supply chain, all the way through from refinement to the wing of the airplane. So FBOs and distributors, each of them are going to have to consider the multiple factors in that process that influence their decision to distribute and sell the emerging fuels. For fuel distributors, material compatibility testing, again, throughout the supply chain has been historically provided through an industry consensus standard, specifically ASTM. In the absence of an industry consensus standard in ASTM, it will be challenging for the market to establish best practices, consistent practices, and quality control standards for safe fuels distribution. Now, let me be clear. The concerns have been identified of, can these fuels be sold in the market today? They can be sold in the market today. Insurance protections can be provided in the market today. An ASTM standard is not a requirement for these fuels to be sold in the market today. But those distributors selling fuel and those FBOs selling fuel typically, again, rely on those standards, and they will have to make their individual business decisions as they go through these evaluations. Fuel distributors are also evaluating the consistency of fuel supply, consumer confidence, and user demand for these fuels as they emerge.
Thank you, Kurt. Pete Bunce, President and CEO of General Aviation Manufacturers. Obviously, the manufacturers have a very vested interest. What does it look like to them? What's the transition look like to the manufacturers?
Well, Walter covered a lot of this extensively on what the manufacturers really are looking for and transparency in the process. But I just want to go back, Eric, for a second and talk about this whole program. So 19 years ago, Jack Pelton was chairman of GAMA when he ran Cessna. And this whole process started 19 years ago. And as my great friend Mark Baker always said, if this was easy, it would have been done long ago. You saw the complexity up there on that chart. And this is the program that we, all of these associations, put together well over a decade ago to be able to get input from all of our constituents to be able to say, this is what we need in a transparent process to be able to tell everyone that's using this fuel that it is safe to put your family in the aircraft and fly that. So I'm very proud of the fact that we put this together and we have worked collectively and collaboratively up on Capitol Hill to put all of the mechanisms in place to be able to go as we find the solution, to be able to deploy it in a very effective manner. But even most recently, and Mark will talk about just what we're doing to be able to protect us until such a time that we have a solution. So from a manufacturer's perspective, what we really value is transparency and the peer review process, as Walter said. We want to be able to have a consensus within the industry of the fuels that come forward, that they have been vetted by all the smart people within the industry to be able to say, yes, it is safe. So what does a manufacturer care about? They care about, first of all, what did they certify? And how does this compare to what they certified and the methodology that they used for it in their production processes, in all of their cert processes? So as we go forward and there is an STC fuel in that process, we have to have assurances that that all the transparency and our criteria has been met before any warranties would be issued. And it's important to remember that we warrant what we certify. And we very rarely warrant something that is an STC in a follow-on process. And there is no requirement to do so. It's a contractual agreement between the people that produce the aircraft and those that buy it. So transparency is so absolutely vital to us to be able to get to the point where we feel confident that what we sell can be warranted, but also, most importantly, what we sell can be safe. And that is our guiding star, and that's what we will insist upon.
All right, thank you, Pete, for reinforcing the context and the importance of the context. So another important constituent, another important stakeholder is the rotorcraft audience. Jim Viola from VAI, do you want to talk about what this transition means and where we are in terms of the rotor audience?
No, absolutely. Glad to see all the rotorcraft that are here. Certainly feel part of the group here as we solve this issue. Lots of piston helicopters out there. So last time when I was up on stage, the progress that we've made, of course, I was Helicopter Association. We now are Vertical Aviation International, same representation. You saw that Robinson was listed on there as being worked next by the FAA. We also have Schweitzer and Enstrom out there, and we got them in the field as well. So we're excited that the fuels that are out there are being tested, and we do see the end. I'm glad to be part of the XCOM, where we can see the detail and the complexity of the issue that we're trying to solve here. And the big thing is the safety issue, as Pete mentioned. So thanks.
Thank you, Jim. I now want to call on our host, Jack Pelton. First of all, thank you for the wonderful weather, Jack, and I know it's going to continue every day this week. But we're going to have hundreds of thousands of general aviation pilots and enthusiasts as one big, large general aviation community. What does the transition to unleaded fuel mean to us?
Well, first of all, welcome to Oshkosh to everybody, and hope you have a great week. We lined up the weather perfectly, and it's just going to keep going the rest of the week. I want to specifically talk about really the experimental amateur-built community in the transition to the fuel. Because when you look at the work that's being done for the certified aircraft, the pathway to getting the fuel on the airplane is pretty well defined through the regulatory process. As a home builder, as the owner-operator of a home builder, it's your responsibility to actually maintain and make sure your plane is safe to fly, which means if you're going to transition to a different fuel, that's also your responsibility, is to make sure that you can verify and validate that the fuel is safe. That sounds onerous just at face value, but when you dissect the pieces that Walter went through, we've got plans in place and a path to make sure that it is not onerous. For example, with the STC fuel today that is certified, they're providing all the technical information to an EAB owner about the testing they did with the given engine propeller combinations, and they've actually done materials compatibility testing also. That you would then get that data package through them. We'll help assist with that also to make sure that you can then put together an understanding of what may be different in your airplane. And if you looked at the charts that Walter, I mean, there was darn near every possible material on the Earth that's being tested. There's a path to get a hold of that information and validate your particular fuel system, your particular fuel tank, your particular valves as to what has or has not been tested. We would of course also recommend that you go out and fly it to our test manual to assure that the performance abilities of the airplane do meet that. So we're working collectively with all of the people who are producing the fuels to get the information packages and make them available to you, and EA will help coordinate that activity. If you notice in the EAB community also, Vans is doing very specific testing on fuel itself, and that's a large portion of the installed base of the experimental amateur built. So while it may be a little different than everybody else, we're providing the underpinning to make sure that we can be the source to help you get the information you need to make that happen for any maker model of EAB that you're flying. Mark?
Thank you, Jack. So, Mark from AOPA, there's probably no bigger stakeholder constituent than the nation's GA pilots. So what's the update from the flight deck?
So, the three of us are all representing the users of these fuels in the biggest way. And I would say that we all agree that the North Star is always safety. We also don't want to weaponize safety either, a term in terms of we got to move forward. We know that we've got communities and states that are trying to take the ball and run with it. And, the communities have come together and said, hey, we have an agreement, 2030, we're going to make this transition no later than. And I think that means we got to get moving. One of the things that I'm proud of is what AOPA and a couple of donors put together was a project to demonstrate fuel. On the left side of the barrel in front of our tent there, come and look at it, and there's a bunch of pictures and evaluations of the engines and the valves and all this stuff. So it's run just under 200 hours, of which I've flown a couple dozen of it myself. The fuel from GAMI appears to be as good or better than the experience we have with avgas at this point in time, because we want to prove to the market and the community we've got to move forward. We've got to do it in a safe way. We've got to demonstrate this project so that we can keep selling airplanes, keep building airplanes, keep putting money back in these airplanes, because we have 200,000, call it, roughly GA airplanes that need to be demonstrated and feel safe in this transition. Whatever the fuel turns out to be, how fast we can go, we just want to be part of that solution, and along the way, keep burning fuel to make sure we have a supply. That's my number one concern as we sit here today, is I don't want to run out of supply to interrupt this great thing we have now, general aviation, and it's booming. I want to keep it going.
All right, thank you all for the different perspectives. We're now going to open it up because it is as important for us to hear from you as it is for you to hear from us. So we have a few minutes for questions. I think Murray has a mic over here, and Rob has a mic over here. Raise your hand. We'll get to you. Let us know where you're from, who you represent, where your home airport is, so there's a context for your question. Thank you.
Test. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, good morning. John Menninger from Quakertown, Pennsylvania. I'm just curious of how stable Intercept is at this point. Can we expect a supply of tetraethyl lead itself until 2030?
Yeah, I think the question really was, do we expect to keep a continual supply of tetraethylene lead, 100 low lead, available till 2030? We believe that there's over a year's supply today, by the way, on the ground, what I hear, of TEL in the country, at least. And we know that the world is still counting on this fuel, whether it's helicopter supply relief, all the things that general aviation accomplishes. We believe, and we continue to talk to refiners that are currently producing that stuff, they're anxious to move on too. But in the meantime, I don't feel any threat to it from a supply side at this time. I do get concerned about some states or communities saying, we'd like to outlaw or cause there not to be any supply until right now. So we have more of an environmental issue and a local community issue.
Rob, we have a question right here.
Turn this one on. We also, during the FAA reauthorization bill, had language put in there that mandated by Congress to the FAA to ensure that there is a supply through 2030 of 100 low lead. 2032 for Alaska, yeah. So that is in there as a law. of which the FAA will be the ones managing.
Yeah, and to that point, all the testing you heard about earlier, part of testing these fuels is the fungibility or interoperability with 100 low lead. So that will be part of the base testing. The fuels have to be acceptable to be mixed with 100 low lead before they'll get the approvals to be used, because we do recognize this is going to be a transition period and there will be points in time where that may be a need.
My question was basically, how stable is the one supplier that supplies
So the one supplier that puts the TEL out in Liverpool, England, is continuing to build the product as we speak today. Now, do I get concerned that that could change in 24 or 36 months? That's one of our risks, for certain.
Rob?
My name's Stephen Palmer. I'm from Wichita, Kansas. I fly a PA-28-140, has O320, has high time engine. It's it's past TVO actually. Flies great, runs great, oil analysis is great. Are they doing any testing on older engines that's higher time than some of the newer test bases that they're doing it on? Does anybody know? And what kind of outcome is coming out with the fuel that you're testing and the oil analysis that's coming out of that?
Well, if you looked at that chart that Walter had, if you looked on the aircraft side and on the engine side, we're very concerned about the legacy fleet. It's probably easier for any one of the fuel manufacturers to work with forward fit, is what we call it in the industry, of anything produced now. But when we look at safety, we gotta care about everything that's out there, including the aircraft that most of us fly, our legacy aircraft and everything. So absolutely, we're looking at all, and that's why it's so important, the materials compatibility piece to this, because, and as Jack said, if you look at the experimental, and I fly an experimental aircraft, I'm going to be paying particular attention to what kind of sealants were used throughout the aircraft and look to any help that I can get. But that list that we developed for PAFI was specifically with that in mind, all the way back to the warbirds and 1930s aircraft and everything. We care a lot.
Another question there, Rob?
Tim Rail with GAMI. I'd like to clarify a couple of things. First of all, with respect to this gentleman's concern about whether or not the fuel providers have tested both high time and low time engines, the answer to that is yes. We've done endurance testing with both brand new components as well as very well used components with great success. Secondly, with respect to what Mr. Castagna said about PAFI being exclusive to testing components of material compatibility beyond the engine and airframe as a part of our FAA certification, there was considerable oversight and testing done for materials in the distribution process, as well as we've engaged with third-party producers of filters and other components in the distribution, and that is done. Thirdly, with respect to Mr. Pelton's statement about the FAA Reauthorization Act guaranteeing the supply of 100 low lead until 2030, the language actually says that it will guarantee that availability until a suitable replacement is found, for which GAMI's G100UL meets all of that criteria. Thank you.
Which I totally disagree that you meet all that criteria, but we can have another conversation later.
Mario?
Hi, my name is Bill Engelking. I'm based up in Detroit Lakes, Minnesota, and I've got an old Cessna 140, Continental C85. And I've got a question regarding fuels that are authorized through STC. Both the type certificate data sheets for the engine and airframe are extremely broad on that airplane. Literally says it is certified for aviation gasoline of minimum 77 octane. Just out of curiosity, is there anything in the way an STC is written that would short circuit that broad certification of that airplane?
I think, is it on? Hear me out. The question about these older airplanes and older engines, and remember, just a quick history lesson, in the 1920s, we only had 60 octane largely available, 60 to 70 octane. A lot of the engines, 985s, 1340s, the C85, all designed pre-war. And there was octanes, as you recall, the old 80 that was out there, ammonium were certified under that 8087 rule back in the 50s. I don't believe that, the 94 the octane, the UL, the Swift fuel, the 94 that exists today, is a good alternative for a lot of our lower compression, smaller horsepower engines, and it's being widely distributed. I think we're talking about Swift, is also hoping that their 100 low lead that they have in production or in test will replace that and take care of all these older engines. Because as Pete pointed out, we are very concerned. I mean, we are mostly 90% a legacy fleet. And we need to make sure those airplanes, those systems, that Baron I mentioned earlier, that's a 1966. And that's had old bladders in it, fuel systems, and it would perform fine on the GAMI fuel. So that's a really important part.
So yes, currently, if you want to use an STC fuel, you would need to get an STC for your aircraft. Now, and I'm going to simplify this, so don't quote me on it per se, but basically it's just about changing the fuel placarding that says your aircraft has been modified or the fuel is acceptable for use in your aircraft. So that's my understanding is that's the STC you would need to add to your aircraft to be able to use an STC fuel. But that's really no different than what's been done traditionally over the years. So it's not a modification to the aircraft if it's a fuel that has already been tested for use and has been approved for use by the engine and airframe that you have.
Mario, we have another question.
Hi, Julie Boatman. I'm based in Hagerstown, Maryland.
That's just another Eagle stakeholder.
Right. I currently fly an AirCam, so definitely on the experimental side. We all know the GA market is small, relatively speaking, and what I see on the slides is there's been a lot of progress, but we have a long way to go to do what we need to get done in 5 years. And 5 years is a very short period of time, and it doesn't look like we're getting a lot of fuel out in the field to do all these great things. Is there a point at which FAA and industry will need to get behind one fuel in order to make those milestones that we need to achieve in 2030?
So I think the question through what I heard, will they get to one fuel? And I think that's going to be one of the real issues that we talk about a lot is fungibility. We know that both Swift and GAMI and Lyondale are all working through the fungibility of 100 low lead to their fuel. We don't know, and there's got to be an effort, which we talked about yesterday, for the FAA to try and figure out if there gets to be more than one fuel in the market, new fuel, how fungible are they together and what is the alternative? So,
yeah, so in discussions, what we've said amongst the FAA team is that as we go through the approval processes, we have to know and be able to provide for you whether or not fuels are going to be fungible with existing fuels today. So the GAMI fuel has met the STC requirement and has been certified via STC. That was tested with 100 low lead. All the other fuels, we will have to provide a statement as part of the certification as to whether or not they are usable with the GAMI fuel, 100 low lead, which is a requirement. So that'll definitely be provided in the STC. But we want to make sure, for a safety perspective, we're very clear on whether or not we have fuels that are interoperable or not. And then, I don't know any other way to say this. I'm not trying to be a cop-out here, but it's not the FAA's job to determine the economical and commercial side of this. It's the safety issue. So in our approval processes, we will make sure that the industry knows which fuels are safe to be used and which are compatible and which ones would have to be an isolated decision that this is now the fuel I will go with and the only fuel. That is a really complex part of the transition plan that Eagle will be working on, and we certainly will be relying on industry as well as comments from everyday users around this issue. Because you're right, in the GA world, the average FBO doesn't have a half a dozen tanks that they can stratify which fuel goes in which tank. So we recognize that, and again, that's what makes this such a complex issue. I hope that helps.
Rob?
Hello, I'm Scott Macios, Seneca, South Carolina, fly 836 Bonanza. In reviewing some of the previous slides, it looks as though a great deal of thought has been given to the production and distribution of fuels, which is going to be a big challenge. Because there already exists a fully approved spark ignition fuel for every engine that we use, is Eagle involved in expediting that fuel's delivery to FBOs?
Can you repeat that last part?
I'm just saying, because there already exists a fuel that meets specifications for every spark ignition engine on the planet. Is Eagle involved in expediting the delivery and distribution of that fuel akin to some of the data on the slides in the general process?
I think the question, was, is there production of the GAMI fuel, and is it going on right now since it's been approved? I think there's a VTOL, which is one of the largest suppliers of jet fuel. Also, I think in the past had made, Avgas has made over 1 million gallons of the GAMI fuel today, correct?
Each of the distributors and the FBOs, the distributors are working together with all of the distributors are working with GAMI, Swift, and Lyndell and reviewing their products. And specific to your question about the one fuel that's out there, GAMI's fuel that's certified out there. The distributors, Vitol has 1 million plus gallons available. There's conversations going on today with those distributors to get that fuel to market. Mark talked a little bit ago about doing demonstrations. The Baron that AOPA is doing more demonstration flights. So there is an effort to get out there. Each of those fuel distributors are evaluating the decisions they have to make relative to what confidence they need, the transparency that they need in the fuel to feel comfortable in selling it.
Can I just add that one thing, these people are at the table with the Eagle program, all the distributors. So yesterday, for example, we had an executive meeting that went on forever. We talked with the people who are creating and certifying the fuel, like the GAMIs, and all of the major distributors. We speak with them too, so because we're trying to push them as to what the heck's going on. If we got fuel, how do we get it out into the field?
Murray?
Is it okay? My name is Chris DaCosta. I'm the CEO of Swift Fuels. Just have a couple of clarifying comments. First, the jet we all keep hearing flying over, it has an ASTM spec for its jet fuel. Swift Fuels produces UL94 unleaded avgas that's FAA certified for about 75% of the US fleet, and it has an ASTM specification for the fuel. Our 100R fuel, which is going through the FAA process with Wes Moody and the whole FAA team, will also have an ASTM specification for that fuel, which we just balloted. We began the ballot of that at ASTM recently. So it's a misnomer. If you have an STC fuel, it's totally within your purview to get an ASTM spec, because all fuels used commercially in the United States have ASTM specs. And our fuels, UL94 and 100R, will have ASTM specs, and that jet flying has an ASTM spec on its jet fuel. Thank you.
All right, we have time for one more question.
I would just add to that,
Pete?
that to what Chris just said, the ASTM process, whether it's a perfect process or not, allows for the consensus and peer review that what we as the OEMs feel is important to be able to have confidence.
in which the distribution network and the FBOs for the last many decades have relied on that peer consensus in order to feel the confidence they need to sell the fuel.
All right, one more question over there, Murray.
John Record, Caribou, Maine. Sometimes, you leave an airplane sit 3 to 5 years, and you can come up to it and drain the 100 low lead out, just flush everything out. And a lot of people that have worked with aviation and auto fuel find a complete difference. How is the stability of this fuel if your airplane's parked in a hangar for 3 to 5 years? Is it turning to gel? Is it going to pretty much ruin a lot of components inside the engine? And also in a wet wing, does it disintegrate the makeup of bladders? Has any long-term testing been done? Because we all know if we let a lawnmower sit 3 or 4 years without putting new fuel in it, it needs a lot of work.
Well, I think each one of the fuel manufacturers is going to have a forum where I would assume they're going to address that. In the length of the program, I don't think anybody has had, in the PAFI program at least, or during the SDC process, unless I'm wrong, Wes, we haven't put fuel in a tank, and they haven't been around that long to be able to go and do that long-term thing. But I'm sure the fuel manufacturers will have an answer to that.
Yeah, and just for clarification, right, the approval process on fuel is about the safe use of the fuel in the aircraft. It's absolutely essential that we understand the materials testing, and that's part of it as well. But Pete's exactly right. I don't think we don't have the lifespan type testing to say what happens in 5 years that's been officially done through the process at this point. So those are certainly questions and part of that complex transition that we're talking about.
So thank you for your questions. The engagement today shows that this is an issue that is fundamental to the future of general aviation as we move forward to our safe and smart transition. And speaking of the transition, as Maria talked about, you heard from GAMI and Swift as part of our Q&A, each of the fuel manufacturers do have a seminar that you're encouraged, because we want you to hear about and learn about the different perspectives. So just a final note before I ask Kurt and Wes to close. As we talked about early on, in our pledge to transparency, which has been fundamental to Eagle since it was announced 2 years ago, our website, we're looking to have that as the seat of information, of education and awareness. We're constantly making updates and adding news, flyEAGLE.org, as well as our different social channels. And with that, I'd like to close it out with Kurt and Wes.
Thanks, Eric. I want to reiterate a couple of things that both Mark and Wes and some folks up here said. First of all, we are very concerned about the safe transition and the protection of 100 low lead during that transition. At the same time, we have to be forward thinking and not let safety be the thing that holds us back, but to move the project forward. So this collective group here, we spent all day yesterday working with FAA and the testing team and the folks responsible for the project of doing this, and we are trying to encourage them to do that. We have 3 competitive fuels in the testing process. We want to do all that we can to hear from them what needs they have. We want to hear from the distributors, from the resellers, and most importantly, we want to hear from you and what your concerns are to help the process along. And so we're grateful for the role the FAA is playing in this regard, the leadership that they're showing to help us do that. And we're very comforted now to know that through the reauthorization and congressional mandate, we have a little bit of protection, and at least to get us through 2030.
Thanks, Kurt. I want to thank all of you for being here today and the interest and the engagement that you showed. I'm going to follow on with what Kurt said by saying, with my FAA hat on, right, the FAA has always been and will always be brand agnostic when it comes to these types of things and certifying parts, fuels, aircraft, whatever it may be. That said, this group, Eagle, that's also our job, to be brand agnostic. A lot of the questions today were about specific formulations or specific fuel being produced. Our job and our tasking is to ensure that whatever fuels come to market are safe for your use and can be part of that smart transition out of leaded avgas into the unleaded arena in the future. So with that in mind, that's our goal and task. Everyone will have to make their own decisions about what they see as the better fuel or the best fuel if multiple fuels come to market. But that's not really our tasking per se. With that said, again, I want to thank you all for being here, for the engagement. I encourage you to continue that because your information provided back to us through feedback and your questions being answered through the information that Eric shared with you on the website or the locations where you can find that are really going to help us make this transition possible and maximize success in that effort.
Okay, I want to thank our panelists, but especially I want to echo what Wes said. Thank you for your attendance, for your interest, for your continued engagement. We need to hear from you. Our next stakeholder update is scheduled for October. It will be virtual, and we look forward to your participation. And until then, enjoy the rest of the day and the rest of the show. Thank you.